I want to thank you for all coming, and I want to welcome you to Homefront, South Dakota during World War II. I want to begin by thanking Miss Judy Lehigh for bringing the South Dakota State Historical Society's At Home and Abroad exhibit to Dakota Wesleyan University, and for her superb production of the sister exhibit on Dakota Wesleyan University during the war years that's displayed in the library's reference section. My task today is to supplement the history that is on display in the library. In the next few minutes, I hope to highlight some of the more colorful and consequential chapters of South Dakota's wartime years, as experienced by those who spent the period 1941 to 1945 within the state. Mine is not a presentation of military events, nor of the combat experiences of South Dakotans who served in the armed forces in the European or Pacific theaters. Instead, I offer you a sketch of the home front, a historical framework for appreciating the less glamorous, but nonetheless critical contributions and achievements of everyday South Dakotans who, by working diligently and sacrificing quietly in their local communities, helped to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II. Let us begin by acknowledging that World War II had a transformative impact on the state of South Dakota. No single event changed the trajectory of South Dakota history more than the Second World War. To appreciate the changes wrought by the war, we need to recall just how poor the state's economy had performed in the 1920s and the 1930s. We must also recall how isolationist we were on the eve of World War II. For most of the nation, the 1920s was a time of great prosperity. In that decade, America experienced an unprecedented business boom. It was, after all, the roaring 20s. Personal and corporate incomes rose. Homes were being built and bought. Workers in American industry experienced a 26% rise in their real wages in the 1920s. The average work week was declining from 47 to 45 hours. And for the first time, Americans were flush with disposable income that they could apply toward the purchase of a motor car, household appliances, or a radio. But for South Dakota, a state dependent on the health of its agricultural economy, there was no prosperity. The 1920s was one of the worst decades in the state's economic history, surpassed only by the Great Depression and the Great Plains environmental crisis of the 1930s. The state's economy, which during the First World War had prospered spectacularly because of the European demand for foodstuffs, was by 1920 contracting at an alarming rate. In the oversupplied ag market, crop and cattle prices collapsed. The sharp decline of farm prices in the 1920s and 30s, the average value of farmland, for instance, fell from $71.39 an acre in 1921 to $18.65 an acre in 1935, crippled landowners, banks, and small businesses. Between 1920 and 1934, 71% of the state's banks failed, and this in an age before individual deposits were federally insured, which means you lost your money if it was invested in a failed bank. Personal income plunged, and a large percentage of South Dakotans were receiving federal relief. Drought, soil erosion, dust storms, insect infestations, and malnutrition plagued people who were unemployed or underemployed, dependent on some form of federal relief, and barely holding on to their homes, their businesses, their farms, and their ranches. The mood of the men and women on the plains in the years just before Pearl Harbor, writes a historian, was somber and cautious. And I would add, suspicious. The majority of South Dakotans, unable to identify anything constructive having come out of World War I or the post-war Versailles Treaty, were isolationist and neutralist in their worldview. They dreaded the potential loss of life that a world war would cause for their population. Congressional hearings that exposed wartime profiteering by Eastern industrialists and Wall Street financiers were fresh in their minds. They were skeptical, if not outright mistrustful, of the foreign policy of the Roosevelt administration, which by 1940 was inching the United States toward greater involvement in World War II. Members of South Dakota's congressional delegation, Representative Carl Munt among them, reflected their constituents' attitudes. Munt favored an America First policy that would, in the words of William Manchester and Paul Reed, create a fortress America, immune from foreign attack and insulated from the perils of international intrigue, unquote. Munt's isolationism was consistent with the conservative notion of the times that world war ultimately benefited international communism. Remote from the nation's financial and cultural hubs, South Dakotans like Munt distrusted the cosmopolitanism of Eastern liberals who allegedly filled the ranks of the Roosevelt administration. South Dakotans feared the impact that America's military involvement would have on free enterprise. President Roosevelt, they felt, was steering the nation toward involvement in a war that would cripple capitalism. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, showed South Dakotans that they could not isolate themselves from world affairs. Overnight, the mood of the state changed from isolationist to interventionist. South Dakota's men and women answered President Roosevelt's call to arms. It is estimated that the state contributed 64,560 servicemen and women to the war effort, 2/3 of whom were inducted under the Selective Service Act. A county-by-county tabulation of military service reveals that 4 West River counties, Custer, Lawrence, Pennington, and Stanley counties, reached the highest percentage levels of enlistment and induction per capita. I will leave it to your analysis to determine why that was the case, and maybe at the end of my remarks, one or more of you can offer a theory as to why West River military inductions exceeded those of East River inductions. I have a few theories of my own I might share with you. Within a few months of the Pearl Harbor attack, the revolutionary economic impact of the war was being felt by South Dakotans. As no other single event in the history of the West, writes Gerald Nash, the war stimulated economic growth, unquote. After 2 decades of wearying economic stagnation, South Dakota's agricultural economy was rebounding. Arguably, the greatest wartime contribution made by South Dakota was their supplying of agricultural products to feed the U.S. military and the peoples of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and any other nation resisting the Axis powers. For the first time since the 1920s, the number of acres planted to leading crops like corn, wheat, and oats began to rise to meet wartime demand. South Dakota's farmers and ranchers benefited from the excellent weather and growing conditions evident during World War II. What makes the agricultural expansion of these years remarkable is that it occurred at a moment when South Dakota's farm labor population was experiencing a steep decline. Tens of thousands of South Dakota men and women joined the armed forces, while other young South Dakotans were being enticed to leave the state and fill high-salaried positions in shipyards and manufacturing plants on the West Coast, or in larger middle American cities like Wichita, Kansas, where the Boeing Aircraft Company built a satellite plant, and where my aunt worked during World War II, by the way. South Dakota suffered a whopping 8.3% population loss from 1941 to 1945, a higher population loss than during the worst years of the Great Depression. I might also add that in-state employment opportunities with federal agencies nearly tripled during the war years, providing another outlet for prospective farm laborers seeking higher incomes. Now you can imagine the impact this population drain had on agriculture. The number of acres planted was increasing at the very moment the farm labor population was declining. Harvesting crops, noted a contemporary observer, was a tremendously difficult task that taxed the farm population to the breaking point, unquote. The farm labor population, which dropped from 119,000 to 92,000 from 1940 to 1945, proved inadequate for the task. So townfolk and rural communities and even citizens from larger South Dakota cities went out into the fields at harvest time, as did Army Air Corps servicemen stationed at airfields in Sioux Falls, Watertown, Rapid City, and Mitchell. Imported laborers were recruited to bring in the harvest, and German POWs held in South Dakota encampments lent their efforts. Part-time workers aside, the average acreage per farm laborer increased over 65% from 1940 to 1945. During the same period, the number of animals ranch and dairy operators were caring for rose by over 50%. The shortage of ranch hands in West River, South Dakota, severely taxed ranchers. Simply put, during World War II, the shrinking South Dakota farm and ranch workforce made Herculean contributions to the nation by working longer hours to produce more food. They could not have done so without the efforts of blacksmiths and mechanics, a small group of citizens who are the unheralded heroes of the South Dakota Homefront. American industry had converted to a wartime footing, so tractors, windrowers, and other implements were not being manufactured during the war. Military needs for iron, steel, and rubber superseded the needs of the average South Dakota farmer and rancher. New replacement parts were non-existent. Hence, the state's blacksmiths and mechanics had to improvise the means and the parts to maintain old machinery that was being pushed to the limit to meet harvesting requirements that far exceeded previous years. Without their services, wrote an observer, this country could not have possibly harvested over 75% of what we finally did get into the bins. In 1944 and 1945, the blacksmiths and mechanics were the lifesavers, unquote. Another contemporary wrote that blacksmiths and mechanics, quote, worked all day and not infrequently all night in an effort to keep the machinery available, unquote. Furthermore, it should be noted that due to equipment shortages, it was very common for South Dakota farmers to pool their resources and share their equipment, not to mention their time and energy. The states of South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming manufactured few wartime products from 1941 to 1945. There were, however, South Dakota industries like the K.O. Lee Company of Aberdeen that produced machine and tool products, and right here in Mitchell, the Rosa Motor Company, which during the war years filled contracts for war material totaling approximately $1.5 million. The shops of Rosa Motors produced small aircraft precision-type engine parts of less than a pound, ammunition dies and punches for the making of shells, and axles and bearings for ammunition carts. Whether one was working on or off the farm, his or her personal income rose dramatically during the war years and after. That the poverty of the Great Depression had been overcome was evident in the state's per capita income figures. One of the nation's largest jumps in personal income occurred in South Dakota, a state that during the Depression suffered the lowest per capita income in the United States, but which conversely saw its per capita income jump a whopping 240% from 1940 to 1948. Unleashed, that income helped fuel the remarkable post-war economic boom that grew the American middle class. South Dakota's open spaces and sparse population made the state a logical location for wartime military installations. What was seen as the Great Plains' least attractive feature, its isolation, became its greatest asset as the War Department selected sites for the facilities that would prepare American armed forces for a global war. South Dakota provided facilities for training programs, the largest of these being a United States Army Air Force technical school at the Sioux Falls Airport, established in 1942, where 45,000 radio operator mechanic students were trained. Linwood E. Oyos, an emeritus professor of history at Augustana University, underscores that this influx of servicemen transformed the city of Sioux Falls. The presence of thousands of Army Air Force students enlivened the Sioux Falls business climate, spurred a citywide housing boom, created thousands of jobs, and exposed the homogeneous Sioux Falls population to a variety of American subcultures. Other South Dakota cities that became homes to military installations included Pierre, Watertown, and Mitchell, which were sub-bases of the Sioux City Army Air Base, and of course, Rapid City, which witnessed the Rapid City Air Base become our state's distinctive military installation, Ellsworth Air Force Base. Here in Mitchell, the municipal airport became, in the summer of 1942, a sub-base in support of bombardment operational training units stationed in Sioux City. Between August and October 1942, the federal government spent $2.9 million constructing 6,700 feet of runways and administrative buildings and barracks to house military personnel. The Mitchell Air Base was in use from January 1943 until November 1945, during which time 6 planes were typically available for limited types of bombing training that occurred at a bombing field near Gan Valley. The construction of the base was of permanent value to Mitchell when the Army turned over the installation to the community after the war. South Dakotans living near military installations worked hard to provide a welcoming environment for the airmen from across the nation who underwent training in the state. United Service Organizations, or USO, chapters were established to, in the words of a contemporary, make the servicemen's leisure time entertaining and to take them out of the reach of the myriad of Army followers who provide a type of cheap, tawdry, and unwholesome entertainment. I'll let you determine what an Army follower was and what kind of entertainment they provided. USO centers were established by the residents of Mitchell, Aberdeen, Rapid City, Watertown, Deadwood, Sturgis, Igloo, Brookings, Vermilion, and Sioux Falls. The Mitchell USO Center, referred to locally as the Recreation Center or the Soldier Center, was in the Armory Building. Each day between the hours of 6 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., servicemen could visit the center to play ping pong, chess, checkers, or cards, to write letters home, read, or to assemble puzzles. Mitchell locals provided a sewing service, stocked a snack bar, and lent a piano and a jukebox. The center was the scene of ballroom dances, and on Sundays, special events included dinners, drives, and pheasant hunts. The local PTA extended volunteer help to operate the Mitchell Soldier Center. Sioux Falls boasted as many as 5 different USO centers, including what was referred to as the Negro USO Club, located in St. John's Baptist Church, an African-American parish located on North Minnesota Avenue. Until an executive order by President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948, military units were segregated, as were the nation's USO centers. When America went to war in December 1941, only about 125 African Americans lived in Sioux Falls, which at that time numbered about 35,000 people. Significantly, before the establishment of the Sioux Falls Air Base, Sioux Falls was a relatively integrated community. By the fall of 1942, 200 African American servicemen were stationed at the Sioux Falls Air Base, which also comprised a sizable population of Southern white servicemen and civilians for whom integrated businesses and places of amusement were repugnant. So, African American servicemen discovered that wartime Sioux Falls, while a relatively warm, friendly, and tolerant community, was also a temporarily segregated community that shut off black servicemen from the business life of the city. Hence the importance of the St. John's Baptist Church Uso Center, which provided black troops with all the activities and offerings of a typical USO. The larger Sioux Falls community did its part by chipping in furniture, a piano, a radio, and reading materials for the patrons of the center. The generally respectful and decent treatment that African American servicemen received from the community explains why, after the war, some of them settled there, because they noted they received better treatment from the citizens of Sioux Falls than from the United States Army. The most remarkable servicemen's organization in the state, I would argue in the nation, was Aberdeen's Red Cross Canteen. Situated on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway, the city of Aberdeen was a required 30 to 40 minute stopover for servicemen traveling on coast-to-coast trips. It is estimated that over 600,000 servicemen and women frequented the Red Cross Canteen located in the railway station, where they were treated to the legendary free pheasant sandwiches. The canteen's never-exhausted supply of pheasant sandwiches was made possible by the donations of local hunters who organized hunting trips with the purpose of filling large storage lockers furnished by an Aberdeen locker company. On average, the Aberdeen Red Cross Canteen volunteers served 25,000 servicemen and women per month, which added up to about 830 pheasant sandwiches per day. One wonders how close the hunters of Brown and the surrounding counties came to exhausting the pheasant population of that region. The majority of South Dakotans did not reside in communities with USO or Red Cross centers. Nearly all of the state's citizens, however, expressed their financial support for the war effort by purchasing war bonds, and no Americans were more dedicated purchasers of bonds than South Dakotans. Under the classification of Series E bonds, which were referred to as the people's bonds because they were a certificate designed to attract the money of a small investor, South Dakota led the nation in number of sales per individual, as well as in other categories. Series E bonds were issued in denominations of $18.75 to $3,750. South Dakota's per capita purchase of these bonds far exceeded that of any other state. In total, South Dakotans purchased war bonds worth $328 million. Ladies and gentlemen, those are $1940. And that, of all the eye-popping statistics I was reading putting this together, that was the most eye-popping. In addition to that eye-popping figure, they also contributed $2,281,000 to the Red Cross. A chronicler of the South Dakota Homefront experience writes that taking into account the state's financial and agricultural record, the people who stayed at home have justifiable claims to sacrifice and effort as those who took a more glamorous part in the war as servicemen and women. Though it was not particularly glamorous, food rationing was an essential component of the war effort. One soon discovered that he or she could not purchase a tube of toothpaste unless an empty tube was presented at the time of purchase. Locals received food for freedom loans to boost the production of poultry, eggs, meat, and milk. Others planted victory gardens. A garden will make your rations go farther. Plant all you can, it was said. Everything was rationed: meat, coffee, gasoline, tires. For every purchase of meat, you surrendered ration points. The number of points depended upon your preferred cut of meat. Sirloin steak, 8 points. Brisket, 4 points. Canadian bacon, 11 points. Ham shank, 7 points. You consulted your ration book before purchasing coffee. Stamp number 26 in Book 1, good for 1 pound until midnight, April 23rd, 1943. Gasoline purchases were strictly regulated. For you A drivers of passenger cars, coupon 5 is good for 4 gallons of gasoline. And as the gas station attendant pumped the paltry 4 gallons into your tank, he inspected your tires to inform you how much further you could go on your shrinking tread. With 4 gallons in the tank and adequate rubber beneath your automobile, there was no excuse not to attend the scrap iron dance with your wife or best girl. In fact, you were encouraged, strongly encouraged, to attend the dance. There is a bomb in your backyard. It's a dud now, just a pile of junk, but that could change. Unless we put on a united front, now, the battlefronts of this war will creep ever closer to our doors. So let's jolt them with junk. Locals attended scrap iron dances throughout the state of South Dakota. At a dance in my hometown of Gregory in May of 1942, a gathering of citizens deposited 90,000 pounds of metal. Enough, according to one authority, to build 5 tanks and 450 machine guns. Local movie theaters sponsored a scrap iron show. Bring 25 pounds of scrap iron or rubber and go to the movie for free. In kitchens across the state, women were cooking their meat at lower temperatures, which they were told yields 15% more servings on the average. Homemakers were urged to save cooking fat. For salvaged fat was used to make glycerin, which in turn was used for first aid and for defense production work. What munitions from kitchens were present in your home? In what little ways could you support the war effort? Had you planted a victory garden? Had you led your community in a bond drive? South Dakota's elementary and secondary schools and her schools of higher education did their part to support the war effort. A sizable number of male and female teachers served in the armed forces. And the teaching profession, it should be noted, produced more reserve officers than any other vocational or professional group in the state. 30 South Dakota teachers turned servicemen died during World War II. Those teachers who do not serve in uniform answered President Roosevelt's call that every schoolhouse become a service center for the Homefront. South Dakota teachers became air raid wardens, Red Cross and USO volunteers, supervisors of metal and rubber salvage drives, first aid instructors, and directors of bond drives and sugar rationing, tire rationing, and fuel rationing programs. Having been asked by the War Department to equip their schools to prepare graduates for wartime service and industry, school officials adjusted their curricula to place a stronger emphasis on mathematics, general science, physics, welding, and physical education. Larger high schools offered courses in aeronautics, electricity, and radio fundamentals. Schools were expected to orient students to military life, and at least 35 South Dakota high schools instituted military drill programs. Students were encouraged to plant victory gardens, get involved in rationing drives, salvage scrap metal and rubber, collect paper and rags, and spend their summer months on farms or ranches or at the local farm implement dealership. 10 schools provided ground school training for prospective pilots, and Watertown High School was only one of 10 high schools in the nation that offered a flight training program. Schools conducted salvage drives that collected vast amounts of scrap metal, rubber, and tin, and interestingly, milkweed pods. Milkweed seed floss is buoyant and a perfect filling for life jackets, which had formerly been filled with kapok fibers from Java, an island occupied by the Japanese. Students in 36 East River counties collected 14,000 bags of milkweed floss during the war years. The labor shortage that affected South Dakota agriculture also affected South Dakota schools. Superintendents and principals assumed teaching duties, and former teachers were called back into the classroom. Some rural schools in western South Dakota counties were forced to close because of teacher shortages. Overall, however, teacher salaries rose during the war years. The state's colleges and universities filled a vital role due to their sponsoring of ROTC programs, which during the war were asked to accelerate their training regimen. Even those colleges without ROTC programs were asked to accelerate their degree programs by reducing vacations, lengthening summer sessions, shortening semesters, or adopting a 12-month schedule. In the early years of America's involvement in World War II, selective service boards were generally lenient in the granting of deferments that allowed a student to complete an academic semester and, in some cases, to return to school the following semester. Medical and engineering students were provided with the most lenient of deferment options, though as the war progressed and the military's manpower needs became more pressing, student deferments became less frequent. 5 South Dakota universities, Black Hills Teachers College, Huron College, Northern State Teachers College, SDSC, and USD participated in civilian pilot training programs, and Northern State contracted with the Army to run a glider school. Those schools with nurse training programs, Dakota Wesleyan University among them, made a unique contribution to the war effort. The war seriously affected university athletic programs. The only South Dakota institution of higher education the only South Dakota institutions of higher education that did not temporarily suspend intercollegiate athletics were Dakota Wesleyan, Yankton College, and South Dakota State, which were able to maintain their basketball programs during the war. In 1946, a year after the war ended, only USD, Yankton College, and DWU fielded football teams. On the other hand, every South Dakota college and university expanded its intramural physical education programs during the war. I want to emphasize that South Dakota's wartime effort demanded compliance. Now, compliance has become a bit of a dirty word among a segment of South Dakota's population since the COVID-19 pandemic struck us a little over a year ago. And yet, World War II imposed all sorts of regulations and restrictions on the average South Dakotan, who did not need to be reminded that unity was necessary to defeat the Axis powers. Uncomfortable personal sacrifices had to be made, individualistic impulses had to be restrained. In small, relatively innocuous ways, personal freedoms had to be temporarily forfeited in pursuit of victory. Wartime South Dakotans did not have the luxury to quibble over civil liberties because the survival of the nation was at stake. Accordingly, they restricted their travel. They limited their gasoline consumption. They lowered their speed limits. They reduced the use of their automobiles. To purchase sugar, butter, meat, coffee, or canned goods, rationing stamps were required. Rent and price controls were instituted to serve the needs of wartime industries, ensure the fair distribution of consumer goods, and control inflation. But when the war came to an end on September 2nd, 1945, South Dakota had emerged stronger than it had been in 25 years. The next few years were a time of unprecedented prosperity for South Dakota agriculture. Farm production was fully recovered. The state's total number of cattle reached levels not seen since 1920. Farm foreclosures became increasingly rare as farm commodity prices rose, farm incomes rose, and indebtedness was reduced or liquidated. The war-induced recovery of the state's agricultural industry was felt by all South Dakotans, whose standard of living and material well-being were significantly enhanced. Having endured sufferings and horrors that transformed them, South Dakota servicemen and women returning home discovered that their state had been transformed by the war. Their transition to civilian life was made easier by the state's low unemployment figures and the economic opportunities available to them in both small and large communities, and made possible by the sacrifices of those who served their state and nation on the home front. Tragically, not all South Dakotans returned from the war. They made the ultimate sacrifice, and so it is with some remarks about the price of World War II that I will conclude my presentation. As I noted earlier, the state of South Dakota provided 64,650 of its citizens to the ranks of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Of that number, 1,560 were killed in combat, whereas another 484 died of other causes. 2,144 South Dakota members of the armed forces died during World War II. Maybe no family paid a higher price during the war than the Meyer family of Mitchell, South Dakota. Their son Louis enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in September 1940. The Battle of Britain was raging at the time. Shipped out to England in 1941 and survived the crash of the Wellington bomber he was piloting on his 12th mission. He eventually transferred to the U.S. Army Air Force, where he converted to fighter aircraft. Louis Meyer was killed in action over North Africa on January 14, 1943. The Meyers' son Francis enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in August 1941. He received his wings with the RCAF, but then, like his brother, transferred to the U.S. Army Air Force. Francis Meyer died in an aircraft training accident in Arizona on July 28, 1942. The Meyers' son Cletus joined the Army Air Force and rose to the rank of tech sergeant. He died in an accident in Australia in May 1945, just 4 months before the war came to an end. The Meyers' son Martin and their daughter Doris served overseas, and both survived the war. Nevertheless, it is believed that the Meyers of Mitchell were the only South Dakota family to lose 3 children in World War II. And that, I suppose, is the greatest testimony to the sacrifice endured by those on the home front. For amid all the laboring, the victory gardening, the rationing, the bonds drives, the salvaging, the volunteering, and the training, South Dakotans' hearts were overseas. Few were the families who did not have a loved one, a relative, a friend, a close neighbor, a work colleague that was not in harm's way or training to go into harm's way. The wait was agonizing, and sometimes the news was personally devastating. Yet they could not display their agony, and if the news was devastating, they could not prolong their mourning. For one day, the other men and women would return home. It was the mission of the men and women and boys and girls on the home front to ensure that their return would be to a better place than the one they left behind, that the men and women who served the nation's armed forces would be welcomed home to a stable and prosperous and optimistic South Dakota that would have made all their longings, hardships, and sufferings worth the price. As you tour these 2 wonderful exhibits and a library dedicated to the memory of a World War II bomber pilot, I think you will agree with me that the mission of the home front citizens of South Dakota was splendidly accomplished. Thank you very much. I would be willing to field questions. I may not be able to answer them, but there are a couple of historians out in the audience who might field questions as well. But are there any questions or comments you might want to make? Yes, Dr. Mitchell.
The information I have is that there was a dramatic increase in the productivity of agriculture from the 30s to the 40s and the 50s. Did you run across anything that talked about, I mean, you talked about people being brought in and, more workers and so on and so forth, but it strikes me that something else is going on too, that perhaps the mechanics, perhaps somebody was figuring out new and better ways to produce more output.
Yeah, actually, the amount produced the amount of crops produced in the 1940s was on a smaller acreage than had been produced in the 1930s of a comparable size. So I'm not enough an expert at agricultural engineering or cultivation techniques or anything like that to be of any help to you to answer that question, but smaller amounts of acreages,
Themselves says a lot.
yeah,
Producing more on less acreage.
yeah, they're producing more on less acreage.
Something had to be going on.
Yeah, they're producing more on less acreage. We have to remember the growing conditions are excellent. You compare South Dakota and North Dakota. North Dakota had some pretty rough growing years between 1941 and 1945. There was spotty drought in North Dakota, so the wheat crop up there was punished pretty bad. Everything I've read, and again, I'm not an expert on South Dakota agriculture in World War II, but everything I've read is excellent rainfall, the right amount of snow, excellent growing conditions, just the perfect situation for crop production, which might help explain why they were so productive on smaller amounts of land as well. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir.
Were the farmers in South Dakota exempt from rationing on fuel with everybody else in the cars?
No, they of course had, they were exempt from any kind of rationing. They could use all the fuel they needed. Tires were rationed, and you couldn't, if you had a tractor that needed new tires, don't expect to get new tires, and you were expected to go a lot further. But gasoline was never a problem. There was this debate, well, even before World War II broke out, 1939, 1940, as we're inching toward war, there's this concern that if we do go to war, in this global war, so many farmers, such a large size or large number of the labor force in agriculture would be drafted, there'd be no one back here to work. So there was this discussion about granting deferments to agriculture laborers, but very few were granted. I mean, the manpower needs were so great, and if you could make a case before the boards, the selective service boards were made up of local individuals, local bankers, local political figures, small businessmen who knew the situation of their community. And if they felt it was necessary to grant a deferment in a particular situation, they would do that. But all the hopes and aspirations of the isolationists that the agricultural population would not be drafted didn't happen. And nor could you hold Johnny back on the farm. Johnny wanted to contribute to the war effort. And he was going to contribute to the war effort. Yes, sir.
I just have, the only small quibble I have is on your read on the 1920s. From my reading, I think that there's no doubt from 20 to 25, agriculture was in very dire straits. But I would say from 25 to 29, it got better. I'm not saying it was good, it wasn't, but after 30, of course, then it went completely downhill.
Yeah.
But the second comment is that I thought your talk did a really good job of emphasizing what I call military Keynesianism, in the sense that it was state intervention in the economy, and especially with the military procurement side, and all those functions that went along with that, that really jump-started the U.S. economy.
Absolutely.
So this take that, straight, what I call social Keynesianism in the 30s, that Roosevelt was trying in different factors through all his programs, was not that effective for the U.S. economy. And that,
It was
against the Roosevelt recession of 37, 38, when they tried to turn off the pump a little bit.
Yeah. You're right. It might not have been, you're right, in that it might not have been a benefit to the larger economy, but it sure kept a lot of South Dakotans on the farm. If you look at farm income from 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, a sizable part of income is federal relief for farmers.
40%.
Yeah, that's basically how they stayed on the farm. But I don't disagree with you.
The other thing was your point or question about why West River counties might have had a higher percentage of service people would be, my take on that is that I think, at least ecologically, I think you have to make a big demarcation even during the dirty 30s about how severe the drought was, and and granted it was bad in the central part of the state and even in the eastern part of the state, but I think the western part of the state, it was pretty dire. So that it's still dire. So I think people might have just decided that
There's no,
it was nowhere to go but up from here.
yeah, no economic opportunity, might as well join the service. Yeah, that's a good economic explanation. I have a couple of cultural theories I'll talk about later. Joel, and I'll go back to Joel first. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the excellent.
Well, thanks, Joel.
In the church and center, the Welcome Center across the street on the east wall, there's a photograph taken in 1940 of a peace march on this campus, sometime in 1940. And as I was looking at that, like, what's that about? Is it correct to assume that that would really be supporting isolation? In other words, peace is like FDR, don't respond to Churchill. He's pleading for help. Don't go there. Is that really what's going on in a rally like that?
It could be,
On
Joel.
this campus?
It could be that. I would probably lean towards your interpretation of that. The Midwest was the epicenter of the isolationist movement. I mean, it literally was the epicenter. We felt betrayed by the events of World War I. Of course, Gerald Nye, who's leading this investigation of war profiteering, he's a senator from North Dakota, and Munt and others are in the Nye mold, and Charles Lindbergh's originally from Minnesota, and he's the America First leader, and so the Midwest kind of had this tradition of resistance after World War I. So I think you're probably dead on, Joel, that it was less a pacifist march and more of a America First. Right. That's a great observation, by the way. Yes, sir, you had a question.
You mentioned mechanics and blacksmiths being very key. And I had one of my friends that had a tire shop, and he said they were kind of the heroes too, because just keeping the tires going, boots and recapping and everything. Because you couldn't get a new tire oftentimes unless you had the right ration stamps. And they said people kept tires going for whatever the whole war. There's one patch on top of another. So you need a good tire man that could happen.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. That's an excellent point. A good tire man. Really good point. Yeah, any other questions or comments? Yes, sir, JP.
Made the reference to prisoners of war serving on that. Where did the prisoners of war come from, and how many were here during the war?
I can't answer the second question with any degree of confidence. I'm pretty certain most of the POWs in South Dakota were German POWs captured after Rommel's Africa Corps was defeated in Tunisia. And approximately if I'm not mistaken, about 90,000 German POWs were captured when the Africa Corps was defeated. And I believe those are the POWs who came to South Dakota. I hope I'm right on that. I'm live, so if I'm not, I'll apologize to my fellow historians around the state.
I do believe there was a camp up by Big Stone that was German.
Interesting. German POW camp.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Randy. I know there was one over by Sioux Falls because when the harvest was coming in around Sioux Falls in 44, 45, a lot of POWs joined it.
Yeah, they worked in the fields.
Yeah.
The cornfields back then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just reading information of Mr. Yank in South Dakota. There was a German camp there, and they used the prisoners in Gurney's seed nursery in the fields. I was just reading that just last week.
Yep. I think
Yank did history.
that's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure there's some material out. Well, there actually is a little material in Professor Oyos's book about German POWs wanting to remain in South Dakota. They were treated so well, and of course I'm sure it was a shock to be in a democratic nation and to be treated so well. So yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else? I have to offer my cultural theory of West River Selective Service. Jim McLaren and I used to have these conversations about subcultures, the East River subculture and the West River subculture. East River subculture is shotgun culture. West River subculture is rifle culture. And growing up in West River over long spaces where you grow up with rifles, hunting bigger game, I wonder if maybe that might not have some impact. I think West River's more heterogeneous in terms of its culture as well, Native American populations, and that exposure, I think, to other cultures that we get in West River makes us a little bit more worldly, a little bit more adventurous maybe. So, but the economic theory is hard to refute. But there are cultural differences between shotgun and rifle culture, I think. Yes, sir.
Would there be anything to the notion that at that time a disproportionate percentage of the Native Americans lived West River?
You know,
There's a warrior culture. They've always served at higher level percentages than others.
that is a great point, Dave. Irrefutable point. I will say this, though. When I was putting this together, I was struck by the fact the number of, the small percentage of men in Shannon County, Todd County, you know, the home to Lakota Sioux, the small population there that actually served in the military. In other words, you know, in Lawrence County, you get this high percentage of population, and in Pennington County, Stanley County, very small number in Todd and Shannon. And I'm wondering if part of that was they failed their physical examinations. Maybe, you know, the malnutrition was a serious problem in the 1930s on Indian reservations. I mean, it was poor enough in South Dakota off the reservation. On the reservation, I'm wondering if maybe there was a failure rate during the physical process or something. Nevertheless, you're right. The per capita, the number of Native Americans serving in the military in any war in American history surpasses any other ethnic or racial group. So, but yeah, that could be, Dave. It could be that maybe they were inducted in these counties. Maybe they left Shannon and went over to Rapid City for induction. That'd be fun unpacking that. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Right before you mentioned the Native Americans that served in Pacific Windtalkers.
Yep, and from South Dakota, yeah. I mean, a lot of the publicity surrounds the Navajo code talkers, but of course there were Lakota code talkers, and I have a great story. I grew up with the White Pipe boys, Gary and Brian. Gary was my age, Brian was a year younger than me. And their dad, Charles, worked for the REA, Rural Electric. And he was retired. This is a few years before he died. And the phone rings one day. And his wife picks up the phone, and it's the Lincoln newspaper. I don't know if it's called the Lincoln Star Tribune or something like that in Lincoln, Nebraska. And they asked to speak to Charles, and Mrs. White Pipe said, well, he's sleeping right now. Can I take a message? And the reporter on the other end of the line said, yeah, we want to interview him because he was a Lakota code talker. And she goes, no, he wasn't. No, he was not. He served in the Marines in the Pacific, but he wasn't a Lakota code talker. Well, that's the information we have, ma'am. Could we speak to him? Yeah, I'll go wake him up. So Mrs. White Pipe goes and wakes up Charles. Charles picks up the phone and starts having this conversation. Gets done, and his wife says, were you a code talker? He says, yeah, I was a code talker, but I was sworn to secrecy. And when I took that code, that oath of secrecy, that meant I couldn't tell you. So she didn't find out until shortly before his death that her husband was this hero code talker. Yeah, it was an incredible story.
Yeah, that's the comment. My father served in North Africa, in Tunis, in World War II. And the story my mom always told was, I mean, when you talk about the level of sacrifice, but also the constraints you just said about what people knew and what people didn't know. Well, when my father shipped out, I mean, letters home and this stuff was heavily censored.
Absolutely.
And that he made a reference to that he had gone to a Chinese restaurant when he was in New York. And my mother took that to say that she thought he was going to the Pacific Theater, that she had no idea where he was, you know, even. So, I mean, in today's culture, you know, this idea that we got to know TMI,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
TLI, too little information, they had none.
Where we want to tweet where we're stationed at, right? Yeah, that wouldn't cut it. Yeah, that's a great story. Anybody else have any anecdotal stories like that? Those are colorful. Yes, sir.
I would like for you to mention some of the South Dakotans that served and survived, like George McGovern.
Yep.
And of course, Joe Foss.
Yep.
And Cecil, what's his name, from area was a fine age too.
Okay.
Joe Foss made the comment that you learn to leave the target by hunting pheasants.
Yep, I have read that. I have read that. Well, I know that to be a fact in that my uncle was a gunner. Well, he was an engineer on a B-17, and engineers on B-17s manned the top turret. So he had to go through gunnery school in Kingsville, Arizona. And he talked about the advantages he had over his colleagues who'd never hunted pheasants before and knew nothing about leading a target. And these boys from South Dakota were excellent machine gunners because of that. Yeah, when I was in basic training, Joel might want to jump in here on this. When I was in basic training, the best marksman in my company was from Mobridge, South Dakota. Company, you're looking at probably around 280 Marines, and best marksman was from South Dakota. And I'm sure you were a good marksman. I know it. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts? Well, thanks for coming, folks. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.